Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, June 30th, 2020, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the possibility of the District of Columbia becoming a United States state, essentially being the 51st star on our flag that gives the United States, addressing the Washington or District of Columbia as an actual state, meaning they would have voting power in the United States Senate, United States House of Representatives, and they already contain voting power in the presidential election, but we will discuss that a little bit more in depth. Essentially, the House of Representatives just passed H.R. Bill 51 with a vote of 232 to 181 on June 26th, 2020. This is the first time in United States history that the House of Representatives has passed the statehood bill for the District of Columbia, and now it's on to the United States Senate. And the Democrats are pretty hopeful that if they do win the presidency and win back the Senate and retain the House, they could possibly get the District of Columbia, making it an official state. I don't know what the name would be. I know some people were discussing New Columbia, but I'm not so sure if that would actually be the name of the state itself. And the District of Columbia is, a very interesting area. It's a very solid Democratic district itself. It would definitely send 2 Democratic senators almost always. It has never voted for a Republican in a presidential election, and I think that's the only part of the country that can actually say that. And, a lot of Republican opposition to it because they know the actual consequences of D.C. becoming a state would essentially mean that the Democrats would have an upper hand in the House of Representatives with just 1 seat, but still could make or break a majority, and in the United States Senate, adding on a total of 2 seats as required from a state in the United States. So, by the way, this was actually a member-decided video. Anyone that joins as a senator or above, meaning senator or president, on the little join button right next to my subscribe tab, you get to recommend a video. And I decided to do this one a little bit early, considering the fact that it's very relevant, and the House had just had passed this bill to make D.C. a state. So, the realistic possibility of this becoming a state under the current congressional delegation is very slim. The House of Representatives is owned by the Democratic Party, but the Senate not so much. And also, if you take a look at the support for it nationwide among senators, there are a number of senators that are supporting it, but only 41 Democrats support it. 53 Republicans, all of them, oppose it, and 6 Democrats say they will not support it. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they want to be more bipartisan, and that some of their representatives or constituents do not necessarily want to see D.C. as a state. I think Rhode Island's 2 senators will come around. I think Jack Reed and Sheldon Whitehouse may have a little bit more to say about that, but once that comes around, it'll be around 53 to 43 with 4 Democrats that are non-sponsoring it. And if you take a look at the senators that aren't sponsoring it, it makes sense. If they want any chance at a re-election bid, Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona, depending on how this race ends up on Election Day, if they end up with 2 Democratic senators, they may end up sponsoring these D.C. statehood bill, but they also are going to need support from Joe Manchin. They're going to need it, of course, from those 2 Rhode Island Democratic senators. And Angus King, he's not a Democrat, but he is an independent who caucuses with the Democratic Party. So this could actually be passed with just a simple majority. So if the Democratic Party, let's say they're able to go ahead and pick up another seat in Arizona, that knocks down the Republican non-sponsored down to 52. They pick up another seat in North Carolina, down to 51. A seat in Georgia, down to 50. A seat in possibly even, Kansas, down to 49. Montana, down to 48. The possibilities for the Democrats to pick up seats in 2020, Colorado is an absolute gain for the Democratic Party. So that's another seat that could knock down the Democrats possibly, losing this vote. But I think that after the 2020 Senate elections, a lot more Democrats are going to want to come around. And there's a reason for that. Let's take a look at where this stood around a year ago. April 2019. 33 Democrats supported statehood. Only 33. Now it's all the way up to 41, with 6 Democrats saying they would not sponsor it, whereas back in 2019, 14 Democrats said they would not sponsor it. I mean, Dianne Feinstein in California, or in Oregon, or Washington, or Nevada, we saw opposition from some of these Democrats back in the past, even a year ago, and including Michigan. I mean, some of these, both of these senators were probably worried about the eventual 2020 Senate election and thought that maybe if they supported D.C. statehood that it would somehow damage them, or they just chose not to make a comment on it or did not express full support. But now, after that House vote, a lot more Democrats have come around. Michigan is locked down. New Hampshire, Oregon, California, Washington, Nevada. These states have just been locked down in favor of the D.C. statehood bill. And let's talk about it. Let's say it goes into the United States Senate. That would make the Democrats at a very clear advantage to possibly win the overall Senate elections. I actually included Maryland and Virginia as 3 Senate seats, both, just because DC is compact right in the middle and there is no DC button. I've decided to just go ahead and assume, let's say, the Democrats do go ahead. Let's use the fill button here. That way it's easier. The Democrats do win, which they probably will, both Senate seats in the District of Columbia and not Maine. Why am I saying that? Maryland and Virginia. That would pretty much give the Democrats 6 seats in that entire DMV area. Now, the DMV stands for District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. I know that's the Department of Motor Vehicles, but from where I'm from, we refer to it as the DMV, so that's the terminology I'm using. That includes 6 Senate seats, which means the Republican Party would have a very difficult job at winning the United States Senate back. I mean, they already are at a point where they could possibly lose the Senate in 2020 with a number of states that should be safe for the Republican Party that are very competitive now, that do have a real possibility of going to the Democrats. And if you add on 2 more Democratic seats, it's pretty much absolute that the Democrats will be at an advantage in every single election going ahead in the future, because there is no possibility the Republicans ever win in D.C. ever. The Republicans have never won there on a presidential level. While it is only 3 electoral votes, it does always add to the Democratic column. D.C. never voted for a Republican. Not in their, shadow congressional elections. Not in their, delegate election with Eleanor Norton. And, she's the current delegate to Congress. She essentially serves as a congresswoman from D.C. She does not get voting power. There's also this thing called a shadow senator and a shadow representative. Essentially, they go into the United States senator, but they are not recognized by the U.S. government, meaning they are not seated as senators. They are not treated as representatives, but they do necessarily, I guess you could say, represent the District of Columbia in a sense that they could. Puerto Rico also has some, depending on the area itself. They may or may not have them. I know DC and Puerto Rico does have shadow office holders, if you could describe it that way. But once DC becomes a state, if it happens, sorry, not once, if DC does become a state, these essentially shadow office holders will probably end up running for the real races and probably end up representing DC on the nationwide map. And a lot of the idea behind no taxation without representation, it's very ironic that DC isn't considered a state. Now, I'm not saying I personally would support or not support DC becoming a state, but it does seem to be very ironic that the nation's capital, the capital that fought against the British for not being able to be represented in Britain, even though they paid taxes to the king. It's just very ironic that DC does not get any form of representation other than that in name only. I mean, they don't get any voting power, meaning they can't necessarily push anything. Eleanor Norton does push bills and can sponsor them, but again, you can't vote on something that you sponsor, which makes it pretty much, it's kind of a sham. Essentially, you're sponsoring a bill that doesn't really have any possibility of you even voting on it, and much less gaining traction in the House. But this DC statehood bill has, passed in the United States House of Representatives, and I think the Democrats are pretty hopeful if they do win back the Senate that they could, with an absolute majority, make DC a state. And it doesn't offer any new type of electoral advantage. The same 3 electoral votes will probably stay, despite DC having a larger population than Wyoming and Vermont. DC is roughly around the 3 electoral college vote margin, so they're probably going to stay there. As for the United States Senate, that would essentially mean there would be 102 senators nationwide, which means that in order to get an overall majority, you'd likely need because the fact that we're at 102 senators makes it very difficult for us to figure out what I guess you would have to have 52 seats and then 51 with a tiebreaker. That'd be so weird just to see 51, because we've stuck with 100 for just quite some time now. I mean, we've had 50 states. It just looks like a absolute number. So seeing 102 would just be very different, to say the least. But besides that, I would say that if DC does end up becoming a state, the Democrats are going to have the advantage going to the Senate elections. I mean, those are 2 solid Democratic states. Almost every single state has had a Republican senator at one point in time. DC will probably never have one. I mean, Trump got 8% of the vote there. Hillary got 90% of the vote. That is the most liberal part of the United States, and will likely stay that way throughout future elections. It didn't vote for Ronald Reagan. This DC has never really narrowed down to anything larger than a 40-point victory for the Democratic Party at the least. So I would say the Democratic Party is in for 2 solid Senate seats here and a very solid House seat. And obviously the Electoral College won't change much because they already have representation on the Electoral College, but that hasn't always been a thing. So while DC has voting power only in the Electoral College. I think that it will be something, fought over. I think they're going to have to do some work in order to convince senators such as Joe Manchin talk about whether or not he's actually going to possibly run for re-election, which he probably won't. Doug Jones probably won't win an election, so that'll be a Democratic loss. Kirsten Sinema, they would have to probably convince her. If Mark Kelly's on board, she would likely be on board as well. And then, of course, those Rhode Island 2 senators, I don't necessarily know what's holding them out so much. And then in Maine, Angus King would probably have to move over. And then any type of new freshman senators that are on the Democratic side would probably have to immediately jump over, because right now, 41 Democrats support it out of 47, the overall majority, and they likely could do some convincing and persuasion in order to move over some of these Democrats. And then once DC's a state, or if DC doesn't end up being a state, again, the possibility of having to do a constitutional amendment is not up to me. It's up to the constitutional scholars and how they would interpret this, would even go into action. The Democratic Party would be at a very good point in the United States Senate if this does pass. They would be at a very good point in the United States House of Representatives, though it is only one seat. Again, every seat matters, especially when you're trying to get the largest majority possible. Denying the Republicans from 200 seats in 2020 could be one of their main focuses. The Republican Party does not have a shot at the House of Representatives, being realistic. And adding on another House seat would only make that more impossible for the Republican Party to win. Even not just in 2020, but if Donald Trump does win re-election, the Republican Party will not win the House of Representatives back in the midterm year. That's just not going to happen. But this possibility of DC statehood would really only happen if the Democrats win the House, they win the Senate, and they win the presidency, and then everything works on their side from that point on. So that's pretty much it for this video. I do expect this map to change, not change that much, but I do think that the Democratic Party will win over some of those senators that are, iffy about their support, the same way they were with a number of senators a year ago. So since the HR 51 was passed in the House of Representatives, we move on to the United States Senate, and we likely will see more support for Democrats as it gains traction. And this could possibly be a top, priority for the Biden administration if he does win the presidency, but it would only be able to work, again, with a House that works with the Democrats and a Senate that works with the Democrats, and then, of course, the White House, which is implied by a Biden administration. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Like I said, this was a member-decided video, so please go ahead and consider joining as a member on this channel. On your screen, there's a video for you tailored towards your interests, and then there's a playlist to the 2020 Senate elections. You can go ahead and check that out. Please consider subscribing on the left if you haven't already. Check out our Instagram and Twitter, and I will see you all later today.